So even though you're going to be the only user actually using this tool, we still want to make it a little more user-friendly. I don't want to have to like keep jumping back into this point VOP every time I want to change something. So let's drop down some parameters and hook them up to here. Now I know that you can say like promote parameter here to get it up here, but then you see it names it for you. And we're gonna have multiples of these, and I don't want them all to just say the same thing. So let's just set it up ourselves. It's not any slower or anything. So I'm just gonna say something like radial frequency. We'll call this the radial small frequency because we're gonna have 2 levels of noise on this. And that's always a nice thing. You'll get much more interesting shapes by not just relying on one noise. So there it is. Now, I'm only using 1 float here, even though the frequency actually asks for 3. Because I'm only providing it 1, you see how it does this dotted line? That's basically saying like, well, I'm going to make the connection, but I don't really want to. What it's going to do is it's going to use the 1 float for all 3 positions. So you can see as I should go back to this one. As I increase this number, it's still applying it to the X, Y, and Z of that guy. So the higher and higher I make this, the more and more jagged this is going to get. And that's the name of the game right now. We want to make like a jagged explosion. So something like that should be fine. Cool. That's a good start. So what else? We got the radial small frequency. We're going to want to do the radial small roughness. The roughness is going to be how sharp this looks. And right now, the roughness is already set to 0.5. By hooking this up, it goes down to 0 because the default value here is 0. So you can see it gets this crazy design like that. So if we bring it back to 0.5, it'll look like the way it just did. Where in fact, I'm going to want to say, let's make this a little bit higher. We could play with this as much as we want later, but this seems fine. Something more jagged now you can see. Cool. So we got frequency, we got the roughness, and we've got our amplitude, which would simply just be the actual scale of the whole noise itself. So I'll just say radial small scale. We'll definitely want to play with that more later. Again, we don't want it to be 0, so let's just, 1 was what it was. So let's just say it's 1 or something, or because I know we're going to add another layer to this, I'm going to bring it down a little bit to something like that. Great. So there you have it. So there's a little box of noise fun. So I'm going to go ahead and group that to make it a little easier to see what it is. We'll call this radial small. And I'll give it some cool little color like that. So let's take that whole thing and let's add another layer, so to speak, of noise onto this. And I'll change the color slightly. Great. So now instead, because it'll be a little easier to visualize if I don't add them together yet. I'm going to move this over. So now we're only seeing this other one, and this will be radial large. Now radial large, the point of this will be to add big asymmetric features to it. So the first thing we need to do is rename these. These have the same names currently as these do, which is why if you click this radial small rough, you can see how all this stuff can be filled in. If I click this, it's all disabled because it thinks it's the same incoming value, and you can only set it once. So it disables it for you. But we don't actually want that. We want it to be unique. So radial large scale now. So now you can see back on top here, we've got all that. Now, just by default, I'm just going to paste these values over just as a starting point. It's kind of weird with that 0 there. Get rid of that. Good. So we kind of have the same thing, but what I want for this so-called larger noise is let's add one more parameter to this, and this is going to be the attenuation. Attenuation is pretty cool. Once again, piping 0 in. Radial large attenuation. What attenuation will do is instead of having our default noise be just like peaks and valleys, depending on which way you push the attenuation, it will have more peaks or more valleys. So let's say if we're here, as I push this here, you can see as the attenuation goes up, attenuation goes down. It's quite different. The default for the attenuation is 1. So that's what it was. Now, so if this is the default, what happens if I push beyond 1? Well, you'll see this. You'll see it gets more extreme. These big features are largely staying the same. I mean, they're going down eventually, but the relative sizes are getting more extreme. It's a contrast. See how in this version, the valleys here are kind of like, they're maybe half the size as this. The lowest points are like half the size of the highest points. But if I go up to like 4, the lowest points are like a fraction of the highest point. And that's what we want. I want to add this kind of extreme streaks to our noise. And this is a perfect view really right here of the kind of thing that I want to add. So I might just leave the 4 there. I added the color to see if that would help illustrate it, although I think the geometry illustrates it just fine. So something like that. Now we can change, of course, the frequency and whatnot here too. Every bit we change is going to have a pretty big impact on it. So I can do something like, maybe I'll bring the roughness down. Well, that didn't change too much. But we could also say like, maybe the scale of this should be like huge. So I could bring these, I could exaggerate these streaks even more. Like maybe I'll make these both 4 and 4. So now we have these crazy scars, these like crystalline scars. It's pretty cool. So there you have that. You can play around obviously with these forever, and that will be kind of your art direction kind of stuff as an artist. So there it is, pretty jaggy, pretty cool. So we'll go back over here and I'll say, add these together. Now they're both scalar values. I don't quite want it in there. They're both scalars, this guy and this guy. And so they're basically just gonna layer on top of each other. So let me switch this. So I have the small turbulence coming in here, and I got the bigger one coming in here. So you can see, as I turn it on and off, you can see how that big one added jagged layers like on top of it. You can see the 2 different layers of noise. These are features that you would not be able to achieve with just the one noise, but having 2 noises, aha, pretty cool. Again, designing the explosion. And these velocities are going to be directly inherited by the particles as they leave the surface. So they're going to look like this. It's going to make an explosion that looks like that. Get you back on top here. Awesome.